Yoshi Players, Yoshi Player here, and welcome back to the final video of the Dig Figures review series. Well, at this point, I know a lot of people are expecting me to do a re-review of Dig Figures the movie, and maybe some future videos if there's ever more Dig Figures episodes, but as for right now, this is the final video of the Dig Figures review series. This is going to be the big video. A lot of you may see this as just a marathon of all the Dig Figures episodes I reviewed, but there's actually a lot more to it than that. Firstly, some of my episode reviews are also going to have some extra thoughts on the video. If a review starts out black and white, then it brings back its color, that means I'm going to add extra thoughts to the video. Or the video has a darker shade, and when it comes back up lighter again, that means I'm going to give my extra thoughts, whatever. It will mostly be regarding the bad episodes because I've received a lot of criticism and defense over the particularly bad episodes. So that's why I'm going to add extra thoughts. Next, I'd like to say that at the end of the video there will be a pie chart summarizing up all of the episodes with their particular rating, and finally giving my top and bottom 5 episodes for the series as a whole, and giving my overall rating for the series. So let's just begin. Episode 1, a bee or something. After Red swallows a bee, his voice becomes auto-tuned. This is the very first episode, and it introduces us to Red, Blue, and Raccoon. I will say for the first episode of the show, it's relatively impressive. There are some legitimately funny jokes in this episode, and I do think some of them work. However, do I think this episode's my favorite? Not really. I mean, one thing, the animation doesn't look great. For the first episode, I thought it should have been a little bit better, but honestly, I think that's just a nitpick. This is a web series after all. There were a lot of stuff that made me laugh in this episode, and I think that's what makes it hold up. So yeah, I think this is a good episode, and definitely worth of being mentioned. I highly recommend you check it out. Episode 2, Panda Hat. Red becomes drunk on his birthday. There's a lot of stuff to talk about in this episode, so let's just get started. So, Red's drunk. This episode gives us a better idea of what Red's personality is like. He loves to drink, he likes to hit on girls. That's who Red is, and sometimes it's funny to watch. The different stuff that Red does in this episode is funny, and you know he's not really meaning to do all those stupid things to everyone, he's just drunk, and I totally understand that. There's also these really funny jokes where Red's hitting on this girl. At one point he acts all tough, and then at the next bit he's all drunk. That was funny. However, there was one thing I really didn't like about this episode, but this is just a nitpick: the ending. Red pukes all over Blue, and it's funny, but really, did Blue do anything to deserve it? Well, I suppose, like I said, it's just a nitpick, because this is only the first few episodes, and once you get introduced to that Dig Figures concept, it's not so bad. So, I think this is a good episode, and it's really funny to watch. Episode 3, Flame War. Red and Blue go to Walmart and try to kill everyone there so they can get the last copy of a game called Flame War, as the title suggests. There's lots of really insane action moments in this episode, Red killing various people who are just wanting to get a game, and the fact that there's a whole war going on just so they can get the last copy of a game, that sounds so stupid, but yet it works. This is also the first episode we're introduced to Pink, and she's a fine character. I mean, she's certainly not the best, nowhere in my top 5 favorites, but at least she's not awful. I will get to reasons why I don't love her. I'll get to that reasons in the few other seasons that I review. And like I said, I really do like her relationship with Blue. It's cute and it's romantic, especially in the movie. Anyway, they have some good moments in this episode. There's some funny jokes, a lot of references. I mean, of course, there's that "I'm Batman" joke. Though I do have one question. At one point, Flame War was sort of like a helicopter shooting game, and now it's become a Call of Duty ripoff. Which one is it? Is there different modes? Oh well, it doesn't really matter. That doesn't hinder my enjoyment for this episode. It's another fun episode, and I recommend you check it out. Episode 4, Traffic Jams. Red and Blue end up in a traffic, and they listen to some jams. Yeah, that's why this episode's called Traffic Jams. Now, you can tell by the tone of my voice that something's not right with this episode. And to be frank, there really isn't. I mean, I don't think this episode is awful, but there were some things I did have problems with. First off, since this episode's short, there isn't that many jokes in this episode. And even though there are jokes, I really didn't find them as funny as the episodes before. Red's listening to jams at one point, breaks the airbag, says he needs another airbag. Okay, that joke was actually really funny. There's this ending with a giant turtle dragon. It's funny and it works, but I don't think that's really enough to hold up for how much I don't like this episode. Yeah, sorry guys, but I think this is a bad episode. Now, when I say this episode's bad, it is in a very interesting way. When I say this episode's bad, that doesn't mean I say it's unwatchable. It's definitely watchable, and I can totally understand why there's people that like this episode. But, if I'm going to be honest, I really didn't like this episode that much. Granted, there was some funny stuff, and Season 1's usually got lots of funny stuff, but there's just not that many jokes in this episode due to the fact that this episode's short. Ending also felt forced. So yeah, I think this is a bad episode. Don't get mad, this is just my personal opinion. Again, I want to clarify to several people that I don't hate this episode. Ironically, this is probably the least awful episode of Dig Figures. I can at least sit through it and get some very slight enjoyment out of it. But the reason why I called it a bad episode was mostly because of the reason that I just thought this episode was particularly boring. Not much actually happens in this episode, and it doesn't pick itself back up until the very end when Red and Blue fight the turtle dragon. Not much really goes on in this episode. It's mostly just Red and Blue making a bunch of car, traffic, and pop music song jokes. But, as I said, this episode is on the very light side of bad. Episode 5, Steakosaurus. Red and Blue go back in time to hunt dinosaurs. Just listen to that whole Back to the Future thing. That sounds really cliched, but honestly, because of all the jokes this episode has, it's funny, and it's really enjoyable. I really like how they animated the dinosaurs in this episode. They actually look really detailed. Okay, not perfect, but hey, at least the animators are starting to get better. Also, as soon as Red and Blue become cavemen, it will be a really funny moment you will ever see in Dig Figures history. Also, I don't know why, but when Blue at the end says, "What is that thing?" and it suddenly cuts to an asteroid destroying them, it somehow makes me laugh, and I'm not exactly sure why, but hey, it's Dig Figures and random stuff happens. It happened out of nowhere, so I guess that's a good explanation. So yeah, it's another good episode, very enjoyable, and of course, very funny. Episode 6, OMG. OMG, this episode is very enjoyable. The whole idea behind this episode is that it's a bunch of visual gags, and for the majority of the part this episode has, it's funny. Yeah, it's short, but the stuff that's funny is really funny. I guess the way I could use to describe this episode is that it's weird, but it somehow works because, like I said, it's Dig Figures, and many random stuff can happen with that. And most of the visual gags in this episode are really funny. Probably some of the best comedy I've seen in a Dig Figures episode. So as you can tell, I think this is a good episode. Not just good, but amazing. Episode 7, Trouble Date. Red and Stacy come to Blue and Pink's date and cause a lot of trouble on the double date. First, let's talk about Stacy. Stacy is a hilarious character, and she's one of my favorites. Now, the funny thing is, she is like Red, which could be one thing why I might not like her, but the reason I do is just because, well, she's a female, and she actually has a lot of interesting character, and she's stupid in a very likable way. She causes misery to other, yeah, but it's usually because she's stupid, and she has a rough life. Hell, she has 3 jobs, and she does care about her friends. No matter what happens, even though she can be stupid. That's the highlight of this episode, just Stacy in general. She's just such a fun character that you like to see all the different gags that she does. Also, there's a lot of really weird innuendos in this episode, like the scene when Red and Stacy are eating all the food, and you realize it's supposed to be private parts. I never realized that when I first saw this episode, and by the time I watched that episode, I was probably a lot younger than I was now. So yeah, even adults might not even get this joke, and that works perfectly. So adding all that up, this is another good episode, and it's really funny. Episode 8. Kitty amazing. Red finds a cat in the dumpster, but unfortunately it kills people. Yeah, this cat kills people. It's because it's adorable. Okay, to be fair, I really don't think the cat is all that cracked up to be. I mean, yeah, they say it's cute, but it doesn't really look that cute. And I know this is supposed to be a joke, it could be ugly, but they think it's cute because of just how funny and stupid the characters are. But even then, I still didn't quite get it. And a lot of the jokes in this episode felt kind of forced. So, it's kind of hard to rate this episode. Is it good? Is it bad? Well, it's just okay. That's all I can say for this episode. There are some good jokes, but not enough to save this episode. I will say, it could have been much worse, but thankfully it wasn't. Episode 9, Role Players. Red and Blue must go on a journey to save Pink from the evil King Richard figures the Long Shaft. Get it? Basically, Richard is a nickname for Dick. I kinda get it, and why it's called Richard figures, and how he has a... Let's just move on. Anyway, the highlight of this episode is Lord Tourettes. This is the first episode he's in, and for what he first stars in, he's a very funny character. I'm very glad he became a main character throughout the series, because he has a lot of funny moments. However, just because of Lord Tourette's scene, does that make this episode good? Well, not really, because I do have problems with this episode. First of all, there's the ending. I really didn't like it, especially when Pink walked out on Blue. That felt kinda mean-spirited to me. I mean, all Blue wanted to do was have a little fun game with his girlfriend, and she just didn't care because she wanted to do other stuff with him. At least try and do something different, and not to mention there's an episode where she later does it and has fun, so what was the whole point of that ending? It just felt mean-spirited, and it's not funny. You really do feel sorry for Blue at the end. Now that's the reason why Pink, I don't really like her that much. Because she just leaves out on Blue and doesn't even give him a chance, even though it wasn't really his fault. Also, there are some jokes in this episode which are funny, but not enough to save this episode. Though again, I don't think this episode is bad, because like I said, there are some good things in it. I guess it's just the ending that really pisses me off. So I guess this episode's just okay. Episode 10, Attack of the Pwns. Red and Blue are in an epic space battle over a burrito. This series just can never get more funnier, can it? First, I want to talk about the animation. The animation in this episode is wonderfully amazing. I mean, they originally said this was supposed to be the last episode. What a great way to pay it off! The animation in this episode is just great. Look at all the different effects in the background and how animated the characters are. Though I do have one little iffy bit. There's one bit where Red and Blue's heads are white, but when they're in the spaceship, they're suddenly back to their original way. I don't understand what the point of that was. But that's just a nitpick. There's a lot of funny jokes in this episode, and the fact that Red and Blue are just fighting over a burrito just shows how crazy their friendship is. The fight in space is really interesting, the music sounds great, and like I said, I really like the effects. So as you can tell, I think this is a wonderful episode. It's great, and I really think it's a great way to finish off the season. Episode 11, Zombies and Shotguns. Red and Blue have to fight off zombies in the mall. Now, at first, you think the whole zombie plotline does seem like a cliched idea, but like I said, it just works in the Dick Figures world because, like Dick Figures, it's got a lot of funny jokes. We get to see Lord Tourettes again because he's always funny as hell. And this episode does throw in some good jokes as well. Oh, and this is also the first episode we're introduced to Bloser, who dies, of course, because Red has a huge hatred for him. That one scene in the episode was probably my favorite scene in this episode. This episode's got some good action moments, though not enough to count Flame War. And the animation, unlike Season 1, looks a lot better. So for the first episode, I'm really impressed with this one. I think it's a good episode. Episode 12, Camp Anarchy. Red and Blue go camping with a bunch of kids. Now this is another short episode, meaning that it doesn't go for that long, but there's actually a lot of really interesting things that happen in this episode. Blue and Red do the same activities, but the way the two are doing it is really different. Also, that whole virginity thing with the trees, I don't get it. Like, I actually don't get it. Blue's childhood was mean-spirited, but I guess for some reason it's kind of funny because Blue tries to get it out of his head and at the end it just comes back to him. I know it could have been mean-spirited, but actually I think it's actually kind of funny. There's a lot of lines that Red makes in this episode that are highlights of this episode, and like I said, this episode's just funny. It's a good episode, and one I watched a couple times again. Episode 13, Butt Genie. Red and Blue meet a hamster genie. Or is it a guinea pig? I'm not exactly quite sure. Anyway, so there's some average stuff to talk about in this episode. Yeah, there are some jokes in this episode, but is that really saying much? I suppose not, but the jokes here are funny to just kind of There's Lord Tourettes' joke, but unfortunately, I think it kind of came out as since you know something bad was gonna happen. It was funny for a bit. The funniest scene, I think, was when Bloser got ripped in half, and I know what he actually meant. My least favorite part about this episode? The ending. It just kind of came out of nowhere, and it didn't really make me smile. I just thought, really? They didn't have enough time to give us a proper ending? If they thought of something better, like the whole world domination that Red was talking about, maybe I would have liked this episode a little more. But as is, it's just an okay episode. Not too many bad things, not too many good things, just something I don't mind seeing a couple times again. Episode 14, Lord Tourettes' Syndrome. Lord Tourettes loses his hat and Red and Blue help him find it. There's a lot of really good humor in this episode. The whole idea of Lord Tourettes not swearing when he has his hat as a whole reverse thing is a really clever idea. I can't believe the writers never thought of something like that. I think it's a really good idea, and I thought they could have taken advantage of it in the later episodes. But again, it's just a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and it works. Sadly though, that's really the only thing I really liked about this episode. Red is just kind of doing his own thing, and it is funny for a bit. There is a scene where they're talking to these two gangster dudes, and that's actually kind of heartwarming and funny. The fact that they look so many different places actually kind of works, and the ending was actually not bad. So how would I rate this episode? Well, there's a lot of good things, and not too many things I didn't like. But I'm just gonna go ahead and say this is a good episode, and if you like Lord Tourettes, you'll love this episode. Episode 15, Fang Angels. Blue and Pink watch a movie and Red tries to get out of jail, but that's really much it. There isn't that many things that happen in this episode because, again, it's a short. And this short episode really doesn't have many jokes. I mean, Blue and Red are just talking on the phone, that's it. There is a couple jokes at the beginning with Blue and this whole dick thing, and that was kind of funny, but that's really the only thing I laughed about in this episode. They're watching some sort of Twilight ripoff, which I suppose is supposed to make me laugh, but to be honest, I really didn't care about it. It just kind of made me frown a little bit. And that's really the best way to describe this episode. It just didn't make me smile. Well, it did a little bit, but that only happens so rarely. I think this episode was kind of rushed. Although a highlight, I love seeing Pink's boobs. Don't take that the wrong way. But how would I rate this episode? Well, there's not too many jokes, and none of them really made me laugh a lot. There was the whole highlight I just mentioned before, which I know is going to gross people out. But unfortunately, I just didn't have a lot of fun with this episode. So I'm going to go ahead and say it's just a bad episode, and I really skip it every time I'm watching Season 2. Episode 16, Captain Red Rum and the Pina Colada Armada. Holy crap, that was a long title. Anyway, in this episode, Red and Blue try to hunt for mermaids. And that's pretty much it. There's not that many things to say about this episode because, to be honest, much like Fang Angels, I really didn't enjoy this episode. Though to be fair, I didn't enjoy this episode a lot. Because the biggest problem I have with this episode is that it's just not interesting. I mean, nothing really happens in this episode. Red and Blue are just kind of being pirates. That's about it. There's a few jokes, but even the jokes didn't really save this episode. They weren't that funny for me, and I really think they came out as jokes I've seen before. There's a whole subplot with Red and Pink and her army, but that only comes on for about a few seconds. Maybe it could have been the main plot of this episode where they're trying to find something worthy and it's a competition between them. That would have been a really good idea for this episode. But because the writers only have 2 minutes to fill in for an episode, that's really all they can do. Not even the ending with Lord Tourettes made me laugh. I know it's supposed to be played for laughs, but honestly, I just didn't find it that funny. So yeah, I think this is a bad episode, and really not worth any watching. And again, I'd just like to say that Fang Angels and Captain Red Rum are again not the worst episodes of Dig Figures. I'd say that the bad episodes so far for seasons 1 and 2 aren't that bad. It's not till season 3 where we actually get into the really awful episodes of Dig Figures, and yeah, we'll get to those in just a second. So again, my major reason for hating on Captain Red Rum was simply because it was both boring and very forgettable. It's not that funny, and the different plot cliches they actually introduced to this episode are a bit confusing. Also, Red says Blue and Pink aren't in an official relationship yet. Keep that in mind when we get to that episode. Episode 17. Why you so meme? Red and Blue meet a meme from the internet. I suppose before I talk about this episode, let's talk about the actual character Trollzor. He's... okay, I know there's people that don't like Trollzor, but to be honest, he really doesn't bother me that much. Well, only very little. I suppose he is funny the first time you've watched him, and if you've never seen memes before and this is the first way to start, you'll probably like how he goes. But even if you don't, he's just not that interesting. He's into games, yeah, but that feels a bit too similar to Blue. He likes a lot of things they both like, they hang out, and yeah, that's about it in this episode. Like I said, this episode just lacks a lot of plot. However, there is a nice little plot that Red actually does care about Blue. He wants to get his friend back because there's this guy that keeps beating him on Flame War. However, that's quickly shrugged down to the ending when Red just thinks that he really didn't care about Blue once again and punches him. Yeah, I really didn't like that part about the episode. There were some funny jokes in this episode, though not much. The majority of them do come from Trollzor, who, like I said, isn't a bad character, so it's kind of hard to rate this episode. Is it bad? Is it good? Well, it's just kind of average. I think this is an okay episode, but not that okay. It was very close to being a bad episode, but at least it wasn't. Episode 18. Sex marks the spot. Red and Blue have to find treasure. First off, I will say, this episode is very enjoyable. There are some very fun, action-packed scenes in this episode. In fact, it's action-packed. It kind of reminds me of Indiana Jones. Has anyone seen that movie? I'm sure everyone's seen it. This episode tries to be like Indiana Jones, and very much like Dig Figures. When they try to be something else, usually it fails, but for Dig Figures' case, it's funny, and it's really enjoyable. Also, the fact that the fat girl is the boulder at the end of the episode, I don't know why, that just made me laugh so hard. That's definitely the saving grace for this episode because, unfortunately, there were a few bits that I didn't like about this episode. The fact that there were some jokes that I knew was going to happen, like when they had to spell out poop. That joke was kind of forced. And the whole dart thing with Blue and Red, I pretty much know Blue was going to get hit because you know what type of guy he is. But the good stuff in this episode is just too darn good. And good enough to make this a good episode. Episode 19. We're cops. Red steals a cop car, and he and Blue start driving around the city pretending that they're cops. This episode has a very simple plot, and yet it's executed really well throughout this episode. Now, one could argue that the jokes are that funny, because, you know, Red and Blue cops are gonna get everything for free. I suppose that is not funny, but there are some saving graces for this episode. Like I said, the whole idea just sounds too stupid to be funny. And I really like that about Dig Figures. Whenever they do something stupid, it's usually really funny. Just the fact that they focus on a simple plot, and yet it's executed well is funny. There's a lot of funny jokes in this episode, and honestly, I really enjoyed this one. It's a good episode. Episode 20. Bath Rhymes. This episode was really hyped up because a lot of Dig Figures fans were able to submit their own animation for a music video. And how does the music video stand out? Personally, I'm really impressed that they're not only able to make cartoons, but actually make some decent music videos. This is a new music video that we got introduced to at this time, and the music video is enjoyable. But how about the submissions? Well, there's a lot of really impressive ones, especially the ones with 3D animation, but then there are some that look like 5-year-old drawings. I'm not offending anyone here, that's just how I felt. However, the song itself isn't perfect. I mean, there's some really weird lines in the song, and not enough to make this episode bad, it's just some of the lines don't make much sense. Not because they're not funny, but just because I really didn't understand them. Personally, I'm still really impressed with this episode, and it's a good episode. However, I wouldn't call it one of my favorite episodes though, because of those very few problems I mentioned, but hey, at least it wasn't okay or bad. It could have been a lot worse, but they managed to pull it off. Episode 21, Adventures of Batman and the Bloser. Batman and Bloser battle Earl Grey, an upper-class supervillain attempting to remove the color from the world. There's a lot of good things to say about this episode, so I'll just jump right to the characters. Now, Red being Batman was usually a joke that was featured in Season 1, but to turn it into an actual episode plot, I suppose it doesn't do too many things bad. I mean, yeah, Red is being Batman, sure, but do I find it funny? Kind of. However, I do like Bloser more. It's just a new superhero idea, and I'm glad they didn't resort to something like Robin or something like that. They gave Blue his own unique superhero identity, and it's really funny. The way they explain it is just spot on. Let's also talk about the villain of the episode, Earl Grey. He is a really funny character, and he's one of my top 5 favorites. I only wish he got more episodes, but this and Fortnite Rises, I guess, are enough. He's an upper-class villain, and he's got a lot of really funny references, jokes, and none of which get annoying. And that's one thing I like about Earl Grey. He isn't annoying. He's your typical villain, and he usually does it because, well, he's a villain, and I totally understand that. The whole idea of the whole world being turned black and white, even though the Dick Figures world is already black and white, is just such an ingenious plot. Really stupidly predicted, but it's also really funny as well. There's a lot of stuff to like about this episode, so I can clearly say that this is a good episode, and a very enjoyable episode as well. Episode 22, Real Dudes Bros Nightmare. During a poker game, Red, Blue, and the gang attempt to discover who can tell the manliest story. I love this episode, and it's easily a good episode. Now let's talk about why this episode is actually so good. For once, we actually see how processed the characters' personalities are. Finally see what type of guy Broseph was. We see an interesting backstory with Raccoon, which would later become one of the main plots for the upcoming Dick Figures movie. Each story in this episode is really enjoyable, and of course the one I enjoyed the most was Lord Tourettes' story. It came out of nowhere, it was very funny, and it had a very satisfactory conclusion. But one thing I really like about this episode is that each story has their own type of animation, as it's based on the character's own perspective, and it's a really neat idea. And of course, this episode has so much jokes thrown at you, and a lot of them are really funny. I never imagined that Ed and Zach would be able to do something this amazingly perfect, and it's easily my favorite episode of all time. I guess you guys can already tell which episode's gonna be my favorite for the season. This episode's got a lot of jokes, it's really funny, the animation is really spectacular, and it gives you a better perspective of what the characters are like. Episode 23, Terminate-Her. Red, now transformed into a T-18, attempts to locate his enemy at a Halloween party. Where on earth do I even begin with this episode? First off, I'm now going to take this episode calmly because I realize it's just a cartoon that's not trying to harm anything that's actually happened before. But I'm still going to admit this is still a very heart-wrenching episode. So where do I begin? Well, let's talk about the jokes. The jokes in this episode are cringeworthy. I mean, it's been 3 decades since Terminate-Her, and we're still getting all of these Terminator jokes? Seriously? They get very old in this episode, and one of the main problems that Dick Figures has always had is that they rely on one joke throughout the entire episode. The reason they do this is usually because they can't think of any other clever jokes for the episode, or they think it's just a way to make you laugh because they think it's funny. No, they don't get that excuse. Using a joke throughout the entire episode doesn't make it funny, it just makes it become boring. Then let's talk about Red. I thought it was unnecessary for him to be in this episode. And when I say that, I mean, did he really need to have a major plot? I mean, he could have just been there as a cameo appearance. But then again, I really didn't want him to be in this episode. He just really didn't have anything to do, and neither did the plot itself. It could have just been a very funny Halloween party, lots of stuff could have been happening. We don't need to rely on a Terminator plot that we've seen before. It's not funny, it just kinda makes you bored. And then, all the stuff that happens to Blue. He was treated the worst in this episode. Finally having some luck in his life with a hot chick, and thanks to Red and Pink, he gets so miserable. And I know some people are like, oh, but Blue was cheating on his girlfriend. Well, were they even confirmed in a relationship at that time? I mean, I heard that their relationship wasn't confirmed until the movie. I think back then they were just kinda hanging out. They didn't even kiss until the movie, so I think back then they were just very close friends. And there's a very interesting thing about this episode I want to talk about. This Sarah Connor's chick is supposed to be the main antagonist of this episode, but not until the end do you realize that she was supposed to be the main antagonist. Even if she wasn't, she was still a very kind person to Blue, even though it was really a man under that suit. In fact, this scene kinda reminded me a bit of Transformers Revenge of the Fallen. Yeah, does anyone remember that movie? I don't really care. Even though she's supposed to be the villain, I really don't hate her. The character I do hate, though, is Pink. They made her a despicably unlikable antagonist in this episode, because they tried making her that way in the stupidest way possible. She's just jealous? Really? God, I could have so much more bad things to say about this episode. Even at the beginning, her behavior towards Blue was just really unacceptable. I mean, she couldn't even handle the simplest slight of criticism, and yet she still whines and complains like a 4-year-old over it, even going as far as throwing a glass of water at Blue's face. Don't you think that could have damaged him? If you ask me, that's a very, very selfish thing to do, but I really don't want to talk about this episode far enough. It's clearly a bad episode. And not just bad, but just absolutely awful. It's not funny, the characters are completely idiotic, there's nothing funny about this episode, it's really boring, and you just feel sorry for Blue because he's being pushed around by a bunch of idiots. I really loathe this episode, and I highly recommend you don't watch this episode, because I never want to ever again. Alright, so sit back. I have a lot of extra thoughts to say about this particular episode, because out of all the episodes I've reviewed, this is the one that got the most defense for it. One of the biggest defenses was that, oh, Red has to be in the episode because the title's called Terminate-Her. Well, you know what I think when I hear that title, Terminate-Her? I think of the actual Terminator showing up in Dick Figures, a robot to kill someone. Here's how this episode should have gone down. Maybe there's a Terminator that tries to kill Stacy or Pink or someone else, and Red and Blue have to try and save them in a really action-packed car chase scene. You know, maybe if that was this episode, it could have actually been a little bit more interesting. But no, all throughout this episode, they're literally focusing on Terminator jokes, and it's not funny in the least. Someone also said that by this point Blue and Pink were actually in a relationship because Blue said that, "Did you just kill my girlfriend?" in Captain Red Rum. Well, remember when I said to remember Red's line, "It ain't official yet." It's true, because there's also a music video where Blue's like, "I need you to accept my love request." So by this point in time, Blue and Pink aren't in an official relationship. So therefore, it was totally unnecessary for them to get into this really sticky situation. Next up, I don't think Red was actually intending to save Blue's life. It seemed more like he wanted to kill the girl and was unaware of a cop being disguised as her, probably because the entire time Red was drunk. I mean, it literally acts like he was acting like a really stupid person that was just acting really drunk, and he seems to be taking the idea of dressing up as Terminator way too seriously, and actually willing to kill someone just because he's dressed up as a fucking Terminator. And there's even another reason why I hate Pink. If she does this regularly, why would I, as Blue, want to go out with a crazy psychopath as Pink? She's actually willing to let someone else kill a girl, and what's even worse was that Pink probably didn't see the girl as some cop dressed up as her. No, she just saw her as a girl trying to get with Blue, even though they weren't in an official relationship yet. And I bet the only reason she smiled was because the girl was dead, and that Blue can just become miserable because he was calling her suit really, really stupid. Honestly, how can an episode like this get 8 million views, and yet people still are trying to defend it even though it's clearly a terrible episode in my eyes? It's terrible. It's just still so fucking terrible, and I still have no reason why people still continue to love it. Episode 24, Modern Flame War 3. Red tries searching for some boobs on the internet, and apparently the internet goes down, so he, Blue, and Trollzor have to go and find a way to get the internet back. This is the first time after Why You So Mean that we get Trollzor back, and I actually like his appearance more in this episode than in the other episode, because his jokes aren't entirely used for the episode. His faces aren't used as a main plot for the episode, but rather as a random joke in every once in a while. Also, this episode's shown that Trollzor can be more of a badass than what he does. And that's really one thing I like about this episode. It's very action-packed, and there's some really fun action-packed scenes in this episode. There's also a lot of really funny jokes that I would talk about, but honestly, almost every joke in this episode hits bullseye. And hey, we even get Stacy back. That's a really nice thing. I actually didn't recognize her at first, much like Red. Although I do have one little iffy with this episode. That's the ending. What the hell was the whole perfect boobs thing, and how the Earth's suddenly blown up a little bit, and how Red's probably dead? Actually, does Red and Stacy die in this episode? I'm not quite sure, but then again though, that's the hammer of dick figures, and it's just a simple little silly thing that happens, so I really don't mind it that much. It's clearly a good episode, very fun, very action-packed, and of course, very funny. Episode 25, Planet Asshole. Red and Blue offer some visiting aliens painful advice regarding face washing, relaxation, and reproduction. There's a lot of stuff I don't like about this episode. Though, I'll get to the main problems later. Let's talk about the aliens. Honestly, I don't like the aliens. Well, in a kind of strange way. I'm not saying I hate them because they're rude, but because they're just not that interesting. Though, to be fair, I do feel sorry for them later on the episode, which we'll take a look at in just a moment. This episode does throw in some funny jokes regarding the whole face washing, relaxation, and reproduction thing, which I suppose was probably the funniest part about this episode. However, does that do enough to save this episode? Because there is one problem I have with this episode. That main problem is Red and Blue themselves. They were really unlikable in this episode. The way they're pushing around the aliens and that they don't get punished for it at the end just kind of makes you hate them. This is probably one of the only episodes where Blue was also an unlikable character. Does that mean I have to change him from one to second favorite character? And of course, like I said, this is also one of the many episodes where I just hated Red, because he was also being the same way as Blue in this episode. The aliens died. All they wanted was some food. They weren't going to harm anyone. Red and Blue were just pushing him around because they were different. I don't like a story like that. It doesn't come across as funny, but rather just really stupid and mean-spirited. Now, to be fair, I am glad that none of the bad stuff happens to Blue in this episode, and rather more of the mean-spirited humor happens towards the aliens, but really, what's the difference? It's nice that not everything is happening to Blue in this episode, but still, you do kind of feel sorry for the aliens, even if you don't really like him as a whole. There's nothing really more I can say about this episode. It's just a bad episode for me, and I really, really wish that it wasn't even there. Thankfully, though, this episode isn't as bad as Terminate-Her, because like I said, it did do a couple things right, and it's not one of the worst episodes I've ever seen either. Someone once said to me that Red and Blue were just messing around with the aliens in the episode, but at one point you can clearly hear Blue saying, "We were mocking you." Therefore, they were intentionally making fun of the aliens because of this one reason. They were different. That's always something that really pisses me off about reality, and that people make fun of others because they're different. Kind of like how people are being racist. I don't think that's what we were going for this episode, but it still seems like that Red and Blue are just teasing these aliens just because they're weird and they're different, and therefore doesn't make them goofy idiots, but rather really, really unlikable characters. Episode 26, Zeusbag. Red and Blue accept accept Zeus's challenge and attempt to join the Greek gods. Just listen to that plot. Red and Blue challenge Zeus to join the Greek gods. This episode just has so many weird things thrown at you. It's sort of like you're playing some sort of RPG game, except, well, it's just the charm with dick figures, baby. There's a lot of really funny stuff I like about this episode. How Raccoon just immediately loses just because he needs to go take a dump, and how Red and Blue do some sort of Legend of Zelda ripoff, and how they're turned to stone even though it does look like they're getting drunk. There's also that ending which is really funny because every character at the end is just really, really drunk. Also, fun fact, I think this was the first episode we actually saw Blue get drunk, and that's actually not such a bad thing to happen. It's not out of character, because I'm pretty sure most people would drink, and I totally understand that. It's just a challenge. Blue wasn't forced to do it, they just decided to accept that challenge anyway. Yeah, this is a very, very enjoyable episode, and there's a lot of stuff to admire. Episode 27, Chug-A-Chug-A-Brew-Brew! When Red finds out there's no more beer, he and Blue decide to go hunt for some more. This episode gives us a very entertaining, very funny, and very interesting plot that it's so hard not to enjoy. We know that Red loves beer, but just to see him get this desperate just to find so much of what he loves, and for once doesn't always have to be about women. Red is also used greatly in this episode. The fact that he just wants to hunt down beer sounds really funny and adds a lot to his really funny character. The jokes were very random, but hey, it was also very funny to watch. I also liked that climax too. It was really fun. Not the best, but it was also very entertaining. Honestly, I don't know what else to say about this episode. It's clearly a good episode, and it's very, very entertaining in all ways possible. Episode 28, Brain Switch. Red and Blue swap bodies and decide to mess their own lives up. Brain-switching episodes have been known for a pretty long time, and the plot idea behind this episode is nothing new. However, brain-switching episodes can be enjoyable as long as they're executed right, and this episode is executed right. One of the things I actually really liked was that Red was actually trying to help Blue get his job, which shows that Red is a very good friend of Blue, and he just wants to help his friend out. He wasn't messing it up because he was an idiot, he just kind of messed it up because he was having a bit of a panic. I also like that scene when Red is talking to Pink on the phone and how we discover more of her horny side, which is actually pretty interesting. I also like how at the end Red and Blue actually don't end up back in their bodies, but Red suddenly ends up in Raccoon's body, and Raccoon is in Red's body. I will say though, this episode is very enjoyable, it's got a lot of things right, it's a brain switching episode, and I sure do switch this from being bad to good. Yep, it's a good episode alright, and a very enjoyable one at best. Episode 29, Pleasure Cruise. Red and Blue are on a cruise only to find that there are secret agents planning to detonate a bomb. First of all, when I first found out this episode was something related to spies and secret agents, I just lost interest. I mean, I've seen movies like Cars 2, and they execute something like that very, very poorly. But watching this episode, I realized just how funny and crazy it becomes. First off, I like how the ship was called HMS Tragedy, since we all know how tragic the Titanic was, and it's become a great reference to a tragic event. And it doesn't do it harshly as well, it's actually kind of a true thing, and it's sort of funny to watch. The characters once again are used just right, thanks to the events that all occur around them. The secret agents, however, I don't remember much of. I mean, there was just nothing really special about them. That also goes to the villain of the episode. As great as Earl Grey is, this butler wasn't very interesting either. But honestly, those are just nitpicks. This episode still does entertain me a lot well, and I do like most of the things that happen in this episode. I only wish that Blue didn't get much harsh treatment, but you know what? He actually got treated respectively at the end. Red buys him a hot dog. That once again shows that Red is a very good friend of Blue. And like good, this is another good episode. Episode 30, Kung Fu Winners. After ninjas kidnap Pink, Blue and Red have to fight and get her back. Does anyone remember that web cartoon called Zire? Yeah, I actually remember watching that cartoon. It was sort of like a ninja-type fighting cartoon. It turns out that was actually an influence for this episode. Now, at first, I don't think the plot was anything good. I mean, making Pink a damsel in distress was kinda pathetic. But honestly, what makes this episode watchable and really enjoyable is just that it's really, really epic. I like the scene when Red and Blue are fighting the ninjas, and I also like that ending scene where Red's fighting the ancient ninja master. However, the ending didn't work for me. It just turned into an odd Dragon Ball Z knockoff, and how Red killed the ninja master. Also, what Red said at the end of the episode was pretty mean-spirited, but honestly, that is just small nitpicks, and this episode is very enjoyable with all the action-packed fight scenes. There's a few funny jokes in this episode, and it's a great way to finish off the season. It's a good episode. Episode 31, Losing Streakers. Red and Blue go gambling. That's it. That's all that the plot is for this episode. And it does make up for it for a couple things that I like. For one thing, I will say, the backgrounds do look nice. There's a lot of really funny jokes in this episode, and the animation is still really good. However, is that enough to make this a good episode? Not really. Because like I said, the main plot really doesn't go anywhere, and that ending did feel a little bit awkward. Funny, but kind of awkward. There really isn't that much to say about this episode because it's just kind of one thing, Red doing whatever the heck he wants to do, and sometimes it's funny, but not funny enough to save the episode. However, though, that doesn't make this a bad episode, though, because like I said, the animation is still good, like Season 3, and there were a couple things that made me laugh, so I guess there's not too much done for this. I think it's an alright episode. I wish I could have done some things better, but overall, I think it turned out pretty average. Episode 32, Pussy Magnet. Red offers Blue advice to help reignite his sex life. There's a lot of things I don't like about this episode. First of all, the plot just sounds really dumb. Even on paper, it doesn't sound like a very good idea. And of course, the way it executed just felt lazy. This episode's basically saying that women are stupid to fall for anything that Red does, when really I know that women are more smarter than that. The different ways that Red tries to impress all the women in this episode is really stupid and probably something that not every man would be able to succeed with. And that's also why I knew that Blue wasn't going to be able to win at the end of the episode. And spoiler alert, he really doesn't. Every character, aside from Blue of course, is an absolute idiot in this episode because they have no idea what the heck they're doing is even right, or they're just too stupid to even realize someone else's pain. Let's also talk about the ending. A lot of people keep saying to me that the ending to this episode is actually funny, but me, I really didn't even crack a smile, because since everything was silent and I knew that any second Blue was going to burst in and start shouting, I pretty much predicted that was going to happen. And much like Terminate-Her, I have some real issues with Pink again. Look, I know she was shocked by what Blue did, but to be honest, it was all Red's fault. Red was the one that taught Blue all these things, and I knew that he wasn't going to succeed with it. But the fact that she just shot her own boyfriend, and she didn't even care. She just asked why he bothered to do it, and she just does it out of anger. I really don't like that. Even if someone's boyfriend did something stupid to them, causing them to accidentally or probably purposely hurt them, they probably still get worried about them and try to help them out. But unfortunately for Pink, she really didn't in this episode, and I really hate that. But like I said, I really don't think this episode is worth watching. It's a bad episode, and a really awful one at worst. I also want to address, how the hell does this episode not insult girls as in sexism? Blue once said that not every girl falls in love with Red, and yet that's what they're literally trying to say in this episode, is that every single girl in the world loves Red. Women are not this idiotic to fall in love with an asshole known as Red. And look, I understand Pink was worried in this episode and she was scared by Blue shooting her, but at the same time she couldn't have shown any care for her, well, I don't want to say boyfriend because I still don't know if they were in a relationship yet, but she literally shut him down. Maybe there should have been like a split-second shot of her running at him and freaking out because she just shot him, and then show the next shot of Blue in a wheelchair. That could have actually been funny, but no, it's literally not funny and just comes across as really mean-spirited. Episode 33, Taco Tuesday. After being caught trying to escape from an Italian restaurant without paying, Red and Blue are forced to deliver pizzas. There's a lot of stuff I really don't like about this episode. I could make a joke that this episode begins with the Happy Tree Friends title card, because really, this episode tries to be like Happy Tree Friends, a show that I already despise so much on Mondo's channel. I don't like it when an animated series I like is trying to be something that I don't like. I never expected Ed and Zach to fuck up this badly. And you know what's funny? There's a behind the scenes video of this episode, and after watching it, I can clearly say they just tried to throw in a lot of really rushed ideas, which is probably one of the reasons why this episode doesn't work. So as you can tell, there's a lot of really violent jokes in this episode, and a lot of them aren't that funny. Now, it doesn't gross me out because it's just a simple little stick figures cartoon, and doesn't gross me out as much as something like Happy Tree Friends or The Drone, which I never want to talk about again, by the way. But even at jokes, this episode just really rushes those jokes right through just to get it all done. There's way too many jokes being thrown at you in this episode. And there's the idea of, hey, we did that joke once, let's do it again, when they run over several different people. There's a lot of this episode I really hated. And it just angers me that Ed and Zach just tried to make this episode as quick as they can and not try to think through on what exactly they should make to make this episode actually enjoyable. As is, it's really boring, and it's easily one of the worst episodes I've ever seen. It's a bad episode. Episode 34, Ocho Muerte. Blue's romantic cooking for Pink is interrupted by Red arriving to feed his pet octopus, Ocho Muerte, and chaos happens. Now, I'm gonna get this out of the way. This episode, thankfully, isn't as bad as Taco Tuesday. However, there's still a lot of things this episode does wrong. However, the only thing this episode did do was the animation for Ocho Muerte. He was a very well animated character, and to think he become the main antagonist in the Dick Figures movie, that's actually not such a bad thing to do. But everything else this episode just throws at you is really irritating. Let's talk about Red. Again, he has no purpose in this episode. Maybe as a cameo at the beginning just to let Blue know about the octopus. The whole episode is just Blue trying to get in and rescue Pink. There's no need for Red to be in this episode. It's up to this point that I can realize that the devs just want to throw Red into the episode because they think it's going to be funny, when really, it's not. You could use so many more jokes for the other characters. Look at what Chick Figures Nerf Gas did. It didn't have to have Scarlet throughout the whole episode, it just had her at the beginning of the episode. The whole episode was just focused around Lavender. That's why that episode worked. You don't need to have Red in this episode. And another reason why I don't think he's in it is because of the ending. Fuck Red at the ending. He doesn't do anything good other than just throwing his knife at Blue's head because the devs think it's gonna be funny. It's not! It's just really stupid. And I can basically sum up this episode as an everything bad happens to Blue episode. That's true. All Blue wanted to do was cook a romantic meal for Pink, and Red comes in with this stupid octopus and ruins everything, and even doesn't get consequences for it, and just decides to throw a knife at his own friend's head. Red's stupidity can sometimes be taken to the worst level, and this episode is no exception. It's clearly a very bad episode, and quite frankly, one of the worst episodes I have ever seen because it just does everything so lazily bad. And again, I would like to point out that Red had nearly no reason to be in this episode. The idea of Blue looking for the keys, that could have just been what Blue was doing. I tell you what, after Red said, I gotta check on my octopus, maybe that's when he just runs away because he's trying to find the keys. You don't need all this bullshit crappy jokes with Red in it. He had no intention to be in this episode. All the rest of the stuff with the keys, you could have just had Blue doing that. Maybe before he climbs up, he's like, oh, the keys are right on the window. How stupid of me. Maybe that could have actually been funny. And Red wasn't throwing the knife just because he said it was a joke. He's just doing it because he's an idiot. I could argue it's maybe because there was literally a knife in his head and he had brain damage because of it. But Red was already an idiot to begin with. How can he be this stupid enough to throw a knife at his own friend's head? Secondly, I don't think Red shows any care for Ocho Muerte at all. After Raccoon supposedly killed the octopus, Red just stands there and eats his burrito. It doesn't seem like he cares about Ocho Muerte. We could have just gotten to this shot where Red's freaking out and he goes running around for the octopus, and then the last line is Blue said, let's just go get takeaway. Maybe that could have actually been a funny ending. But no, it's just Red standing there, being an idiot and being a real jerk. over and over and over again. Episode 35, First Day of Cool, an introduction to how Red and Blue became friends. After 3 bad episodes and 1 average episode, this episode was actually pretty good. I know I can't really talk about it because it's been turned into a movie, so I won't say too much about it. I'll say this though, the episode is very well animated and it does give you a very dramatic story of how Red and Blue became friends. There's also that fight scene which is actually very, very enjoyable. It's also really cute seeing the characters as little children. It's a very cute way in this episode. But honestly, that's really all I can say. There's also some really good jokes, the backgrounds are really nicely detailed, and like I said, there's a lot of things I really enjoy. It's a good episode, and the first good episode for Season 4. The second one we'll be covering later on. Episode 36, The Red Devil. After getting lost in Mexico, Red and Blue find themselves enlisted as mules in a burrito smuggling operation. I can basically sum up this episode in one word. Stupid. It's really, really stupid. The plot, how it's executed, the ending, there's just a lot of stuff this episode does that's very, very stupid. The plot itself just goes nowhere. At first it turns into a we gotta get home plot, and then turns into a whole smuggling operation that doesn't really need to be there. This episode's called The Red Devil, right? I thought it'd be some sort of Prince and Pauper stuff where Red and the Red Devil get mixed up. Hell, the 2 characters look the same. Maybe we could have got a more interesting plot out of that idea. But no, they stuck to this other plot so they can throw in a lot of really stupid jokes. And like I said, the jokes come in out of nowhere, they make no sense, and they're not funny. The ending is also very, very forced. Red and Blue just kind of drive off the edge and they get killed, and honestly, that's a very, very rushed execution to such a stupid, stupid episode. It's a bad episode, and like I said, really fucking stupid. Episode 37, Freshman 15. Red attempts to have sex with 15 girls at a house party. Ugh, this episode. I personally have to say, this episode is actually very underrated. There's a lot of people that really hate this episode, and honestly, I don't know why. And let me state for the record, I don't think this is a good episode. So I'm just gonna go right ahead and say it's an okay episode. For these very reasons. For one, like I said, much like Losing Streakers, it does have some really nice backgrounds. The animation, like I said, is very nice to look at. Every character tries to make at least one cameo in this episode, and they're actually pretty funny. And the music, you know the music in this episode. It's very, very enjoyable. But my main problem with this episode is this again. Blue just kinda gets tortured throughout the episode for no goddamn reason, and he's got the flu. That's pretty bad. Also, this episode just isn't that memorable. Aside from the jokes and the music, nothing else I really remembered about this episode. The plot is just kind of thrown in there and then kind of comes out back in for a few moments, and it's not really supposed to keep you track. And that's really the only problem I have to say about this episode. But like I said, I really don't think this episode is that bad. It's got some enjoyable bits, some really enjoyable music. Though I do think it's very underrated, I still think it's not that good either. Episode 38, The Ballad of Lord Tourettes, a song about a day in the life of Lord Tourettes. To be honest, I don't care about this episode. Now, that doesn't mean I think it's bad. First of all, I'm gonna say it's another okay episode, but there's not too many things this episode does that's good. The song is nice, and it does stay very true to Lord Tourettes' nature, but much like Freshman 15, I just didn't remember this episode after I watched it. I mean, it just wasn't that memorable to me. I liked the song for sure, but the rest of the episode just doesn't really fall through. The song is nice to listen to, and it is very funny as well, due to Lord Tourettes' very funny nature. Also, this is one of the first episodes where Red and Blue actually aren't the main characters, but rather cameos. Even you guys couldn't do that for Ocho Muerte, why not this episode? But anyway, I don't have too much to say since it's a fairly short episode, but I will say it's got a good song, though I don't think you'll be too invested into it. Episode 39, The Fart Night Rises. Batman and Bloser are hired to provide security for the Olympics. When I first heard about this episode, I got pretty excited. I really liked the first Adventures of Batman and Bloser episode, so I was very excited to see this episode. I also really like the title, The Fart Night Rises. Good one, guys. You're always good at making these really stupid titles for episodes. Well, I sat down and watched the episode, and sadly, it wasn't really what I expected. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think this episode is bad. bad. There's a lot of stuff it does right. Like I said, the fighting isn't bad, and I do like the backgrounds and animation, and Zach do a very good job at making this episode done. But my biggest problem with this episode is just all of the jokes. The episode basically focuses too much on a lot of puns and really gets annoying after a while. It's funny at first, but there's just way too many puns in this episode, and to be honest, I just don't think it's that funny. Earl Grey makes a return, thank God, I'm glad they didn't replace him, and he's just as funny as ever, except when he makes those puns. Like I said, I just like his appearance more in the other episode. But like I said, this episode isn't bad. In fact, I kinda watched it a couple times afterwards. It's enjoyable, only except for the puns, so I'll say the episode's okay. And it doesn't do too much bad, but not too much good either, and at least I did have some enjoyment out of it, enough to make it just okay. I mean, this episode could have been very close to being a bad episode due to all those stupid puns, but honestly, I think it's fine. And finally, episode 40, Robot Frog, a prequel episode showing the events leading up to the beginning of the very first episode of the series. When I first saw this episode, I was like, what? What on earth was going on in this episode? Like, why was Blue dating Stacy? How was Raccoon living with Red and Blue in their apartments? Not much of this couldn't really make much sense to me. Until I realized it was actually a prequel to the very first episode. And just the way I felt surprised by it, I was like, oh my god, I can't believe no one's tried something like that before, to have an episode happen right before the events of the very first episode. I don't think I've seen many shows that have tried that. It's a really unique idea, and this is usually one of the first episodes I saw to use this type of plot. And to add on top of that, this episode's also pretty funny. I like some of the jokes in this episode. The song that Red sings is stupid, but not too annoying, and I do like some of the other plot points as well. It's also interesting to note that Stacy actually sounds like Pink when she was talking to Blue and then suddenly goes her Stacy way. There's just a lot of stuff I really like about this episode, and it's a perfect introduction. In fact, I heard some people say that this was supposed to be the final episode of the series, and if it was, then it's a great series finale. It's basically an entire loop of the series, and I heard this was originally intended to be the series finale. But no, due to popular request, Season 5 was made. But to add all that up, this episode is very enjoyable. It's a good episode and a great way to finish off this kind of average season. Episode 41, GTA Pacific Rim. Red and Blue play the new video game, GTA Pacific Rim, unaware that they're actually controlling a giant robot terrorizing the city. I'll admit, this was actually a pretty good opener for the season. I thought this episode was a clever parody of Grand Theft Auto and one of the films called Pacific Rim. They both came together in this episode, and basically the whole idea is that the episode is about mind control and video games, and it basically takes both of those movies and adds it into a very silly episode. The jokes are good, for the most part. I really like the idea behind it, but I think there's really only one problem I have with this episode, which is the second half. Despite there being some funny jokes in this episode, I thought the second half could have been a really hilarious fight between the giant robot and Raccoon. But no, it has to be a stupid dance-off that was used just because they couldn't have time for an actual fight. I also really didn't like the ending, because as it stands, everybody dies. And we knew that considering the whole twist was that GTA Pacific Rim actually took place in the real world, I kind of expected that was going to happen. But other than that though, this episode has got some very good things to keep you hooked, and I think it's a good episode, and a good opener for the season. Episode 42, Hardcore Chore. Red loses a bet to Blue and is forced to do all of his chores. His method for doing so involves a lot of guns. First, I guess you could say that this episode is a very hardcore episode, and it makes it very enjoyable. I really like the idea that Red and Blue bet who can't swear the longest, and how Red just loses right away. It was silly to see Red doing all of Blue's chores in the worst way possible. Now, I was a bit worrisome when I first saw this episode, because I felt that Red could have easily gone off the deep end for this episode, but honestly, he was used just right in this episode. He's got a lot of really funny moments, and you do want to see him finish off the chores and see if he'll actually survive. I also really liked the day off for Blue, since all the stuff he does is so relatable. Watching our favorite television shows, sleeping, and surfing the internet. I was cracking a lot about this episode, and Blue had some of the funniest lines, especially the Game of Thrones masturbation joke and the very long coffee joke. And that's another high advantage that this episode has. It's very funny, and most of the jokes are thrown in there to keep the plot fresh, and it is a very fresh episode. I'll admit, the ending was silly, but I think it was used just right. So I think this is a very, very good episode, and I highly recommend you guys check it out. Episode 43, Snowjob. A freak snowstorm causes a power outage and freezes Red into a life-size snowman, and Blue and Pink have to help him get out. Now, this episode does something that not many other episodes have done before. Usually it's Blue that needs Red's help, but in this episode it's Red that needs Blue's help. How Blue and Pink try to get Red out of being frozen were ranging from normal to very over the top. The title of this episode is obviously relating to a joke that happens in this episode, and it's the best joke by far. The part where Pink is breathing around Red's penis was predictable to see, but I think it still made for a very good chuckle. I do like the idea behind this episode, and there were a couple jokes that were funny. However, the ending felt forced. Red is set free, and Blue dies. It was something I saw coming a small while away. So how exactly am I going to rate this episode? It does some good things, but the ending felt forced. I guess you could say I think it's an okay episode. It's got interesting ideas, but I just don't think it's executed that well. Other than that, though, it wasn't that close to being bad, and it also was pretty close to being good, but because of that ending, it just kind of fell between the middle. Episode 44, the Dick Figures movie fan music video. This video is based off a song that was used at the end of the Dick Figures movie. There's a fun fact for you all. I actually submitted a submission for this video, and it actually got accepted. Hooray! But that doesn't mean I love the episode, though. First of all, I'm not a fan of Ninja Sex Party. I'm aware that they may be popular on YouTube, but the Lonely Island-esque duo will most likely not hit the scene in comedy music. Sure, I may be aware of what their style of music is like, but that's just me listening to a song they did for the first time. The music video has positives for sure. The opening sequence at the concert is stunning with terrific animation meets real-time filming. It's easily the best part about the episode. The song does have some very cheesy dialogue, and I'm pretty sure some tween boys will really enjoy it. The submitted animations for the video was also good. Some of it looks mediocre, like the animations for the lines said fuck 21 times and the wear a diaper not to shit look like a 10-year-old drew it. But other parts like the retro style animation, the part with the line the more you blow overhead red and blue, and the Lego film scenes were very close and very creative at making a great practical use of effects. But quite frankly, the biggest problem I have with this video is just that Ninja Sex Party are not the music group to carry out a song like this. There are some lines in this episode that are just awful, like, you just watched a whole fucking movie and someone call a doctor cause the movie is making me totally sick. It's very, very cringeworthy, and it didn't exactly make me laugh a whole lot. And to be honest, my biggest problem with this video is just that the song we've already heard before. It would be nice if they thought of a new song and probably not use Ninja Sex Party for the whole fucking song. But if you're a fan of Dick Figures, it's worth watching. And if you're a fan of Ninja Sex Party, you'll probably like this episode too. But it's filled with lame music, and I just hope the rest of the season isn't like this. But I will say, this episode does have some enjoyable moments, but not too much to grab my head around. I think it's okay. Not too many good things, not too many bad things. Feel right between the middle. The Red Planet. Red and Blue travel to Mars and meet a Mars rover robot. I will say, the opening to this episode was actually really good. But that doesn't quite make up for how slobby and formulaic this episode is. But like I said, I think the opening is good. I like the joke about how NASA is changing everything up and how the two astronauts didn't realize it was an actual plane. And the joke about the Mars rover being worth $13 trillion and how you can't wreck it was clever and made me think that Dick Figures can be more than just fart jokes and extreme cartoon violence. But like I said, the episode really goes downhill as soon as we see the rover robot. This character is obnoxious, and he's easily one of the most unfunny characters I've ever seen in the Dick Figures. I could basically sum up the robot as being red, but a robot, and it's not really missing anything. It's just not appealing. But the biggest problem? The episode just feels like a typical Dick Figures episode. And at this point, it's just getting really bland and stupid. Red always gets what he wants, Blue is unlucky 24/7, a silly mashup puts Red and Blue in some semi-crazy situation, and there's a 50-50 chance of a happy or an unhappy ending. And that ending, that ending was one of the worst endings I've ever seen, and it felt like a giant middle finger to the audience, with the creators thinking, we don't have any more ideas and less than a minute left, so let's just do this ending, and we don't care if the audience will be happy or not, because they have stuck with us for nearly 4 years and will watch anything even if it is complete shit. It's a real shame, because I would have come to really, really like this episode, but the way it was executed just felt lazy. It's a bad episode, and one of the worst that I've ever seen. And still, the biggest reason why I hate this episode is primarily for the fact that the ending was rushed. Instead of having some big climax ending, it just goes to the guys trying to shoot the rover robot, shoots lasers at them, and then they die, and then Red and Blue are left on the planet supposedly to die. And the same with the boy's head exploding. I saw that coming from a mile away due to the fact that I saw he didn't even have his fucking helmet on. It's really odd. It's a very, very stupid episode still, and it's still a really irritating ending. Episode 46, A Hobbit of Thrones. Pink and Stacy join Red and Blue on a role-playing quest, and they get high during the quest. This episode is a very, very interesting take. It doesn't sometimes poke fun at pop culture references and current topics going on in the media world. This episode actually makes fun of everybody's obsession with fantasy movies and such. A Hobbit of Thrones find the writers at their best. I will say, this episode was very interesting. It does sometimes poke at fun pop culture references and current topics going on in the media world, but this episode makes fun of everybody's obsession with fantasy movies and such. Let's talk about Pink and Stacy. They are easily at their best in this episode. At first, I thought having them high on popularity seemed forced as a joke to be like, girls can't be interested in nerd movies and games, which seemed odd and quite sexist. But then, I got the idea. I'll admit the entire episode is about how in RPGs you can change the rules and do whatever you want. Having two stoned women control the rules can only lead to madness and giggles. This episode makes for a very silly, satirical, and smart episode. However, I do have one little issue with this episode. I also wish that Red and Blue also got high, so that would make it an even stranger and funnier episode. But I suppose I should rate this episode on what it is rather than I wanted it to be. And for what it is, it's a good episode. And I'm sure a lot of you are gonna watch this episode and think, it's quite smart. And believe me, it is. Episode 47, Das Vidiamond. This episode is very interesting. The episode begins with Red and Blue trapped and are about to get crushed to death unless they tell this mafia gang about where they hid this diamond that they're looking for. The plot behind this episode is very, very simple, and that's another thing. You don't need to have your plot be over the top as long as it's simple and it's executed well. And is it executed well in this episode? Well, pretty much. Apparently Red and Blue need to go buy some alcohol, but knowing Red, he and Blue get to participate in crazy activities. People say the best part about this episode was the montage, but personally, what I really enjoyed the most was just how simple this episode was. The montage, though, was decent. However, I didn't like the fact that Blue was having a bad time. It seemed very old. Hello, it's season 5. Time for a change-up. One of the jokes I really liked in this episode was the bear breakout. It was the most used, and it was used properly. Surprisingly though, this episode also has a very interesting ending, where Red and Blue are just about to get squeezed to death. Red farts out a giant diamond, and boop, they both get crushed to death. It was sudden, and it was a very nice change-up of the typical Dick Figures ending. Overall, I think it's a very enjoyable episode. It's a good episode, and it's very decent. Episode 48, Trash God. Red and Blue shrink to ant size, and Red becomes a trash god. God, where do I even begin with this episode? First, let's start off with the plot. This is nothing new. The whole idea of characters being shrunk to ant size, they meet a group of ants and something interesting happens, I've seen it participated much better in other movies. But that's not the thing I hate the most about this episode. Let's just talk about Red. I hated Red in this episode. He was at his absolute worst. Where do I even begin? He gets rewarded for being a disgusting person, and earlier in the episode we immediately forgive him for stomping on the ants, yet we can't forgive Blue for cleaning up his room, as it's so much worse than Red stomping on ants. I hated that so much, and I thought it made no sense whatsoever. This episode is basically saying to me that Red never has to deal with any problems at all, yet he still gets what he deserves at the end. Blue has to deal with every single one of them, and he still doesn't get anything good at the end. Most of the time, it's usually just Red with a happy ending and Blue with the unhappy ending. This is getting repeated and repeated so much again, and it's very frustrating. This episode barely lacked any comedy and instead just gave us a predictable ending. This ending was one of the worst endings I have ever seen in a Dick Figures episode, and I really hated Red for deciding to shrink Blue even more and then eating him. At this point, you'll believe that Red and Blue should never be friends. A true friend wouldn't do that, as proven in the ending of the Dick Figures movie. I hate just how innocent people think that Red is. They think he's an innocent character throughout this entire episode, yet he did something probably just as bad as Blue. It's fine when Dick Figures doesn't make sense, but in this case, it is just horrendously awful. This is a bad episode, and by far, the worst episode I have ever seen, ever. I hope to God that I never have to watch this episode ever again. And you know what? This episode got defense again! Someone once told me that the reason why Red never cleans up his room is because he wants to keep the ants alive. And that when Blue cleans his room, it's what's killing the ants. And that the reason Red only wanted to keep his room really messy was because he wanted to keep the ants alive. Okay, first of all, I'm sure before this episode, Red probably would have done much worse things to the ants. The fact that he literally tried to stomp on them shows that he doesn't care. He doesn't care about the ants, and he doesn't care about cleaning up his room. And there's another reason for this. If Red actually cared, maybe he wouldn't have tried to kill the ants, or more better, he wouldn't have tried to kill his friend. This episode says maybe Red and Blue shouldn't be friends after all. Overall, that again makes Red both a careless and selfish person. The reason why he wanted to kill Blue was not because he was cleaning up that room and killing all the ants, but just because he wanted power over the ants. That's all he wanted, and it resulted in him having to kill his friend. Here's how I think this episode should have gone down. Have Red not stomp on the ants, Red and Blue shrink down, you can have that whole beginning sequence because it was the only decent thing about the episode, and by the point where the ants finally realize that Blue killed them all, they sabotage him, but Red says, "Hey, you can't kill my best friend," and then have Raccoon come in, turn Red and Blue back to normal, and accidentally killing all the ants, even though Red and Blue didn't want him to kill them because they had families. They were living creatures. They were intelligent. That would have actually been for a really interesting episode. But as it stands right now, it is still the absolute worst thing I've ever seen in Dick Figures, and is indeed the worst appearance that Red has ever had. He is a selfish, careless, stupid, asshole-ish fucker that deserves to die if Raccoon comes back with that fucking atomizer, or whatever the hell it's called. Episode 49, Chick Figures. It's simple. This is a gender-bent episode. After we get the worst episode of the series, we finally get my favorite episode of the season. But I just have one question. It seems that people don't like this episode because the two main characters are girls. Okay, I know that's not supposed to be sounding sexist, but just because the two main characters are now girls doesn't usually make anything bad as long as it's still executed well. As long as Dick Figures still has the charm as, it's still good. And is it good here? Of course it is. There's been plenty of female comedy movies out there, in both movies and television shows. It's quite a smart idea to get a female's point of view of what Red and Blue usually have to deal with. It was much more real, honest, and quite funny. It makes me want to see more of Lavender and Scarlet, two females who felt pretty much more believable as roommates and friends than Red and Blue in certain episodes. Like I said, since this is a female episode, it reminded me a lot of comedy shows like Broad City and Girls, and shows that the writers may be maturing and getting smarter with their writing. I also like that just because the two girls are females doesn't usually mean they automatically get away with everything, well, at least in Lavender's case, and how females can screw up just as much as men. This episode just had so many great ideas. I love seeing the different gender reversals of all the other characters, and it's just a very funny and enjoyable episode. It's a good episode. Episode 50, Happy Birthdump. Red and Blue have to rush home after eating bag Mexican food. This episode is just golden at comedy. At first, it starts off like a typical Saturday morning cartoon, but how it was executed just made for a giggle-fested episode and one that was just highly enjoyable. It's also nice to see that Red also has to deal with the same problems as Blue, especially I love seeing Red getting tortured after what happened in that previous episode. I just love seeing the two having to rush home and both get suffered for it. One thing I always didn't like in most episodes was that whenever Red has a problem, he usually tries to solve it in a very stupid way, and it's usually successful. But it's not the case in this episode. He tries to figure it out in his own crazy way, but it wasn't always successful. The reminders to make them go take a dump led to many giggles. Oh, and then there's the ending. It was just absolutely hilarious. When Red and Blue arrived at their home, every one of their best friends was there to surprise them with a party, which really shows that Blue isn't just a person to take a dump on whenever they want. I don't mean literally, but you get the point. But that he actually has people who care enough about to throw him a party. Seeing Red and Blue pooping right in front of their pants was just one of the funniest moments I have ever seen in this episode. Now granted, not every episode in this joke worked. I mean, the whole Mr. Dingleberry joke was very stupid and annoying. But honestly, the rest of the episode is just too much to ask for. It's a good episode, and a great one at best. Before I review this next episode, I'd like to advise that there will be spoilers. If you haven't bought and watched this episode yet, then don't watch this next part, because it will contain spoilers. But anyway, to episode 51, Figured Out. We see what happens to the cast and crew after the events of Dick Figures the movie. This episode is just best at heartwarming. If you guys have no idea what this episode is, it's actually a bonus episode you get when you purchase the season, and it takes place after the events of Dick Figures the movie. It was just a very, very sad episode. So much stuff here is over the top and ridiculous. For some reason, Blue has a beard, the fat, ugly girl ends up with Red and turns out to have a gorgeous face. Stacey goes back to medical school and is rewarded for being the hottest doctor ever. But one of my favorites was Bloser, who is in prison. The line he said, "You fellas want to take a shower?" had me laughing a lot. It's a joke that's usually used about prison rape in the showers, which really shows that the writers will go to dark lengths for comedies. If one of the prisoners said something like, "Try not to drop the soap," it would have been one of the funniest moments I have ever seen in Dick Figures history. But then there's just that ending, which just feels like a very satisfying ending. After everything that Red and Blue have gone through, even episodes like Trash God, you really do feel that they have been through struggling a lot, but shows that the two truly do have a great friendship, and seeing how they finally meet each other after such a long time at the end was a very heartwarming case. Overall, I thought this was a great episode, and a perfect ending to this series. New kid. Red and Blue bully Sasquatch at high school. Alright, let's talk about some of the good stuff about this episode. First of all, the backgrounds in this episode are actually kinda good. In fact, they kinda remind me a bit of Dick Figures the movie. Even though not entirely, the backgrounds do look pretty detailed. And unlike the other two episodes, this episode does have a reasonable explanation for why Sasquatch is even pissed off, because Red literally tried to throw a bucket onto his head, and knowing Red, that's a pretty douchey thing for him to do. But unfortunately, this episode was bogged down by so many problems. First of all, the animation is just awful. Like I said, the backgrounds are nice, but the actual movement of the characters is so slow and so choppy. I don't understand why. The characters should be moving fluidly. There's even some points where it looks like it's supposed to be in the same frame rate, but other times the characters move so fucking slow. I don't know why. There's literally one scene where Red drops a bucket onto Sasquatch's head, and it moves so choppy. I don't know if it's supposed to be in slow motion or something, but still, it looked pretty bad. Finally, Blue didn't even do anything in this episode to deserve being punished. I mean, yeah, I suppose he did kind of tag along with Red when he was throwing the bucket of beef jerky on the Sasquatch's head, but that's really the only thing he did. He didn't do anything to straight up harm him, it was all Red's idea. In fact, even the characters in this episode do feel a little bit off. Red's a big jerk, and Blue doesn't exactly act like the nervous guy he is. I know it's because they're probably in high school, but still, this kind of bothers me. You know what I hate the most? The fact that this is a Messin' with Sasquatch episode pretty much gave me the entire idea down. That it was just gonna be an episode where Red and Blue piss them off, and they get beat up. The end. It's basically the same thing for all three of these episodes, and it's so annoying. In total, this is a bad episode, and it's a pretty bad way to start off this series of episodes. Episode 52, Campfight. Sasquatch interrupts Red and Blue's camping trip and messes everything up. By this point, I think the creators of Dick Figures are really beginning to run out of ideas. So much so that they're still doing these episodes about an overpriced snack. This episode just pretty much had nothing good at all. I will say though, the animation is better and does stick to the Dick Figures animation style, but only because the animation is not that choppy as last time. Red is just ridiculous in this episode, and when he came out all buffed, I groaned instead of laughed. The fight between Red and Sasquatch was boring, as it feels like a fight I would have seen in a Cartoon Network show about a decade ago, making it all the more unoriginal. And Blue ends up punished in the end because, of course he is. That's now his character and nothing else, as this joke has just become less clever and funny, and rather more mean-spirited and cringe-inducing. I didn't care at all for this episode, and the fact that Red and Blue get beat up all because Red said pussy, I don't understand how that's supposed to piss him off. Yeah, this episode pissed me off even more than the previous episode. I will say it's a slight improvement, but still, it's just a really bad episode. And finally, episode 53, Wild Kingdom. Red and Blue are walking through the forest eating beef jerky, and for some reason Sasquatch just kinda comes in and beats them up again. This is the third episode where they've relied on nothing more than a cheap snack. This episode has so many problems. First of all, not just Blue, but Red gets beat up for no apparent reason. It wasn't Red or Blue who pissed Sasquatch off. I believe it was either the cameraman or some other guy who just left a trap in there. I don't know who the hell planted that mine, but I know for sure it wasn't Red and Blue, because seeing them just walking through nicely, eating some beef jerky, I pretty much knew it wasn't them. So why the fuck did they deserve to get beat up for no goddamn reason? This episode just makes me hate Sasquatch even more than the previous two episodes. Animals can be very fucking stupid sometimes, and this is no exception. The fact that this episode is so short gives you the biggest idea that they're clearly running out of ideas and trying to rely on some cute jokes. Not even the scene where the cameraman farted that pissed Sasquatch off wasn't even funny. It's still very stupid and very annoying. I'm sorry if my Messin' with Sasquatch episodes feel repetitive, because honestly, these episodes feel repetitive. This is not only a repetitive episode, but a very bad episode. And this is one of the worst episodes of Dick Figures I have ever seen in my life.
And that is every single episode of Dick Figures reviewed. Alright, let's get to the pie chart so we can end this video with my lists. So overall we had 31 good episodes, 10 okay episodes, and 14 bad episodes. From what we can clearly see, Dick Figures is a very mixed series. There are really good episodes this series, but when you put the okay and the bad episodes together, it's pretty close. But at the same time, most of the okay episodes were pretty close to being good. However, some of the bad episodes were some of the worst pieces of animation I've seen on YouTube. Some of them could even rival against stuff like Happy Tree Friends, or worse, even Flash Git's YouTube videos. So where does that leave the series rating overall? Well, despite the fact that there's a lot of good episodes and that the episodes that are bad, there aren't as many as the good. Some are okay, but some of the bad episodes are pretty terrible. But you know what? Despite the rating, overall I think Dick Figures is good. Now, to be fair, this series isn't that good, and I probably wouldn't rewatch it, unlike Batman and Spider-Man, but when you really put the series together as a whole, it's still a lighthearted and funny series. Well, except for the bad episodes. Alright, now it's time to get to the top 5 episodes. These are the episodes that stood out to me the most, and were the episodes I will definitely rewatch, especially out of all of the other episodes. Anyway, here's my list. Number 5, Happy Birthdump. This was just a overall really funny episode that knows what to do well with the Dick Figures formula and make it really funny. All of the different ways that Red tries to poop somewhere is really funny, especially how they keep on failing. And number 4, we have We're Cops. The best thing about this episode is that it's very simplistic. It's not too complicated, and most of the jokes they do tell in this episode are really, really funny. And number 3, OMG. This was just a overall really creative episode. The animation in particular I think is the best animation that the series has ever had, with its creative and funny animation. And number 2, Chick Figures. This really pokes fun at the female sitcom series and takes it really well in the formula that Dick Figures always had, and also adding some really memorable characters. And my number 1 favorite episode, Real Dudes Bros Night, man. The only thing I didn't like about this episode was the title. That's it. Everything about this episode was perfect. From the characters, to the animation, to the humor. It was just overall a perfect cartoon and one of the funniest YouTube videos I have ever seen. But when there's plenty of good episodes, on the other side, there's a bunch of trash. So now it's time for the bottom 5 episodes. I'm pretty confident with the episodes that I chose for this list, and some of them are really, really terrible. But with that out of the way, let's begin. Number 5, Ocho Muerte. This is an episode that just had a really unfocused plot, with Red being both a careless and selfish person. He barely cares about his octopus at the ending of the episode, and then, later on, Blue has to try and get back inside with all these other stupid jokes, including the part where Red literally goes into the garbage and tries to poop out his keys. I understand he was trying to help Blue, but you could have just had Blue do all of that anyway. This could have actually made up for a really funny episode. If the ending was like Blue and Pink eating Ocho Muerte, and then at the last second Red comes in and screams, "Where's my octopus?" and then the episode just ends, it could have actually been more satisfying to see Blue and Pink both get a good ending for being actually really careful and careless. It could have actually been really funny to see Blue and Pink get good endings for being good people, and Red being a bad ending for being a really stupid person. And number 4, we have The Red Planet. I wasn't so sure whether to put this episode on the list, because as I really thought about it, the episode doesn't get truly bad until the Rover Robot comes on, but the fact that the ending was literally a giant middle finger to the audience, I knew that this episode had to be on the list. And number 3, Taco Tuesday. This episode should have had a little bit more of a rework. Even the comedy, aside from the gross out, is not very funny. The scenes with the stripper girls and Gelato and the fat girl aren't necessarily that funny, and the overrunning gag with Red and Blue running everybody over isn't necessarily very funny. Again, I don't think the episode is too gross, but at the same time, if you look at it from a simplistic side, yeah, it's pretty gross. And number 2, Terminate-Her. I've already made fun of this episode plenty of times, so I'm going to keep it minimum. Again,
I still really hated this episode. In fact, at the time, it was my least favorite episode. Just from the stupid premise, to how unfocused and stupid the characters are, to the really repetitive jokes, to the overall premise of the episode, is just really, really tedious and annoying. And my number one least favorite Dig Figures episode, Trash God. I will always hate this godforsaken episode. I hate it more than when I hated it when it first came out, just because of how much positive stuff that this episode has received from many people. I still think this is the worst episode of Dig Figures and one of the worst YouTube cartoons ever. And with that out of the way, folks, that's all for now. It's all for the Dig Figures series, and it's time for the Dig Figures review series to end. Who knows what will happen to Dig Figures next? Will there be more episodes? Is the second movie really coming out? Will there be more Chig Figures? Who knows? But for what I can say right now, thank you all for watching this series, and take care.